Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome back Imran Mullah. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you back. For those who don't know, Imran is now Middle East Eye's UK political correspondent, covering both British foreign policy and domestic politics. He's also written for BBC Hindi, Conservative Home, The Critic, and Varsity, among other publications. He studied history at the University of Cambridge. Now, you're the author of a new book titled The Indian Caliphate, Exiled Ottomans and the Billionaire Prince. And it's coming out, I think, in the UK on the 11th of December. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I confess I haven't read the whole book, but certainly in the introductory chapter, you've done some pioneering, unique historical research in the British Library here in London. You've looked at documents and letters and whatnot that have not been published before. And also you can explain the relevance of what you did there, but also your book very much has a contemporary modern relevance, which you'll explain in due course, I'm sure. So it's not just archaeology and history, it's also, there's a political dimension in today's world. But as I say, I'll let you uncover that and explain that to us. So I'll hand over to you and we'll just look at, put up a slide. This is the cover of the book, I take it.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Excellent.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and thanks for the introduction. I'm very happy to be back on Blogging Theology, which I've been on a few times before, but not for a while, I believe. So it's very good to be back. So the book, The Indian Caliphate, refers to an idea, a scheme, a conspiracy, a project, you could say, that ultimately failed. And when it failed, it was forgotten. So it's a chapter, a slice of forgotten global history from the 20th century, largely from the 1920s to the 1940s. And what I've been trying to do is uncover and excavate these extraordinary forgotten ties across continents. So my starting image is this photo I took last year of an Ottoman mausoleum in Western India, in Maharashtra. So there aren't any other Ottoman tombs in India. It's very unusual. And most people there don't know what it is.
Amazing.
It's completely abandoned. It's crumbling almost. And it's quite frankly desolate, although it does still have, I think, a sort of imperial grandeur to it. And so the question that I was asking with this book is, why is there an abandoned Ottoman tomb in the middle of India, or in Maharashtra, a western state in India, specifically in the region of Aurangabad? You know, how did it get here? Why is there a sunken pit in the middle of the mausoleum where there should be a body, but there's no one buried here, and there's sort of graffiti on the walls and stuff, and it's not considered a kind of protected archaeological or heritage site? Now, this tomb, I think, is one of the most extraordinary buildings of the last century, because it is evidence of and points to an incredible global history. The man who had hoped to be buried in this tomb is Abdul Majid II. He's the guy standing up here with a cane in his hand. And he was the last Ottoman Caliph, Khalifa, so the last nominal ruler of the Sunni Islamic world. Here he's pictured as a prince. He cultivated himself as the democrat prince. He was raised in the late Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, mostly in confinement under Sultan Abdul Hamid, who locked most of the princes up. But then after the 1908 constitutional revolution, he sort of emerged into the public eye and styled himself as a democrat who advocated for the empire to become a constitutional monarchy. Now, it was Abdul Majid that first piqued my interest in this topic, because he's such an extraordinary figure. This was a talented painter, a poet, a classical musician. So here's an example of some of his paintings. On the left, you have a mosque. On the right, you have an Orientalist style depiction of a harem. Now, it's very interesting that he should paint this, because he is an Ottoman prince who's lived in the harem. And here he is painting what really bears resemblance to the sort of fantasies of European artists of the Orientalist school, not what the 19th century, late 19th century harem actually looked like. But that was a style that he adopted when he was younger. When he was older, he sort of matured and became more comfortable in his Ottoman identity. And so on the right is a painting called Beethoven in the Harem. And this is actually an authentic depiction of family life in the harem. He's in the painting, and other members of his family playing music. And he absolutely loved European classical music. So on the left, you can see him playing the cello. And he loved Ottoman classical music. And I would say we shouldn't consider Abdul Majid to be a sort of, ardent westernizer and Francophile, and that's it. He also was a very proud Ottoman. He saw himself as a European Muslim. He saw himself as very devout, but he was extremely liberal, very modernistic, very pluralistic, and he indulged in calligraphy as well. So this was a real sort of the equivalent of a kind of Renaissance prince.
Sorry to interrupt. On the picture on the right, if I'm not mistaken, on the right on the table there, you have a bust of Beethoven, and on the floor you have a score. I can just about work out the name. It says Beethoven. So this guy is really advertising the fact that he likes Beethoven. He's a German composer. So he's not identifying Islamically. He's identifying with this pro-Napoleonic Enlightenment figure. Beethoven. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is the European Union national anthem. So he's an interesting choice.
But he would have argued that there's no contradiction between that and his Ottoman identity. So actually, he particularly loved European composers who were themselves very interested in the East and the Islamic world, and considered this to be a sort of cultural exchange. And as I said, he liked Ottoman classical music as well. So this extraordinary, very cosmopolitan, you might think paradoxical man. But I would say there was a coherence to his worldview. Now, this is him as the Khalifa once he becomes the Caliph in 1922, November 1922. So the Ottoman Empire by this point has crumbled. The Sultanate has been abolished. Ataturk is in power, and Abdul Majid becomes the first and last Caliph of modern Turkey. And he's the first Caliph to actually be elected into the role by the Grand National Assembly in Ankara, which means this is an unprecedented political experiment, an unprecedented Ottoman Caliphate without an Ottoman Empire. And there he is on his horse in front of the Hagia Sophia. I'm sure everyone knows what that is.
Or Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. It's often very popular with tourists these days.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And the Turkish government in Ankara, they wanted him to be, relatively quiet, keep his head down. But instead, he made a big show of being the Caliph and of asserting the authority and the prestige of the Ottoman Caliphate, which he believed was sort of still had great importance to the world's Muslims. And it did have importance to many Muslims in the world, particularly in the Indian subcontinent, where most Muslims in the world actually were. But by this point, the Caliphate had lost support among many other rulers, particularly in the Arab world. So in 1924, March 1924, the Ottoman Caliphate was abolished. So the Turkish government decided that it's not going to be possible to have a caliph in Istanbul sort of rivaling the prestige and the authority of the government in Ankara. And
can we just pause very briefly? The significance of this moment in history, in Islamic history, is the first time in Islamic history since the time of the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, that Muslims didn't have a ruler at all. The central ruler, the Caliph, the successor of the prophets, had been abolished.
Exactly. So it was a monumental moment. And this quote on the right is by Ismet Pasha, the Turkish prime minister, who declared, "If other Muslims have shown sympathy for us, this was not because we had the Caliph, but because we have been strong." And he declared that in the Grand National Assembly during the 7-hour-long debate before the monumental vote, and the Caliphate was abolished. And after that, troops surrounded the Dolmabahce Palace. and the Caliph was informed that he was deposed and that he was going to be exiled along with the entire House of Osman, the Ottoman dynasty. So here you have a photo of the Caliph in the palace with the people who had deposed him just after being deposed. So you can imagine he wasn't very happy to have that photo taken. But Abdul Majid didn't accept the abolition of the Caliphate. He didn't believe it was legitimate no matter what the Grand National Assembly said. So this quote here is from a declaration that he issued in Switzerland, having been sent there on the Orient Express. He argued that the authority of the Caliphate came from the support of the world's Muslims. So he declared, it is now for the Muslim world alone, which has the exclusive right to pass with full authority and in complete liberty upon this vital question. So what he was doing here was calling for essentially a reconstituted modern post-imperial caliphate. So it was an Ottoman caliphate that would derive its legitimacy and its prestige not from a great empire, but from the recognition of the world's Muslims, which of course is a very modern idea, and it was anathema to many other Muslim rulers at the time, and certainly to the Turkish government. So here is a photo of Caliph Abdul Majid with Princess Rulership, his only daughter, and they're strolling along a promenade in the south of France, where they lived in a nice seafront villa called the Palais Carabassel. And they could afford this because they were being financially supported by this man, Nizam of Hyderabad. Now, Hyderabad was a state the size of Italy, a modernizing princely state in the Indian subcontinent, basically in southern and western India. And the Nizam was one of the richest men in the world. At one point, he was the richest man in the world. He was certainly a billionaire. This is the seventh Nizam. His name is Osman Ali Khan, and he really had a credible claim now to being the premier Muslim ruler in the world because he was so wealthy, but also because he was in India, and India saw itself as really the epicenter of the Islamic world. After all, this was where you had the largest concentration of Muslims, even though they were a minority. And this is also under the British Empire. And the British Empire, precisely because of this population, bombastically declared itself to be the greatest Muslim power in the world, which obviously was a claim that not everyone accepted, but it was a claim that Indian Muslims actually took on. And Hyderabad claimed itself to be the heir to the legacy of the Mughal Empire and the cultural heir to Indo-Islamic civilization. And it also had great reach in the Islamic world. So there were lots of migrants from the Arab world and from East Africa that came to Hyderabad and often had important roles as soldiers and people in the court. And the seventh Nizam, Osman Ali Khan, is pictured here in one photo in a sherwani and another photo in a sort of Western style suit. And on top, I've included an English translation of an Urdu verse that he composed because he was quite a poet. Sultans of old, O Osman, he's talking to himself, have all died. By your rule are Muslims now identified. Wow. So this is just some pictures from Hyderabad. This is the Chowmahalla Palace, suitably grand. Here you have a very different sort of palace, the Falaknuma, which was built. It was built in a European Palladian style, and this is what it looks like today.
That staircase on the left is simply amazing. Is that something out of a Hollywood movie? It's incredible.
Yeah, precisely, exactly, and it still looks so grand because it's been turned into a luxury hotel, so they take care of it. Now, the reason that the Nizam actually patronized the deposed Caliph was basically because of the legacy of the Khilafat movement. The Khilafat movement was, I think, most people know about it. it was this enormous mass mobilization in the last days, the last years of the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Caliphate against the European allied occupation of Turkey and in favor of the Caliphate. And it was a sort of pan-Indian movement. It was the birth of the Indian civil disobedience movement and thus of the Indian independence movement. And it was pan-Islamic in outlook. And what's really interesting is in this photo here, you have, I'm sure everyone can recognize him, Gandhi, who was absolutely central to this movement. And this points to something very interesting, that pan-Islamic politics did not just come from Indian Muslim politicians, but also from many Indian Hindu politicians, including some Hindu politicians who would later become Hindu nationalists. And this was because they believed and understood that through Islamic politics, India could play an incredibly important role in the world, and that this was a very powerful way of cultivating a kind of global anti-colonial solidarity. Now, the quote on the right is by a man named Maulana Muhammad Ali, who was one of the most important politicians, Indian politicians of this period. Maulana Muhammad Ali was here. He was one of the leaders of the Khilafat movement, and he was here responding to the Hindu nationalist criticism that Indian Muslim sort of love for Istanbul and for the Caliph in Istanbul meant that they weren't loyal to India. So he didn't see it that way. He said, I belong to two circles of equal size, but which are not concentric. One is India and the other is the Muslim world. We as Indian Muslims came in both circles. We belong to these two circles, each of more than 300 millions, and we can leave neither. So this points to a sort of debate about territorial nationality and belonging that is still actually being had today in many countries. So here we have two photos. On the right,
left, Pickthall, of course, the famous translator of the Quran.
Yes, indeed. So Majid Pickthall, this great British Muslim intellectual who produced a translation to the Quran that's still read widely today. And he was patronized in that endeavor by the Nizam of Hyderabad. So he actually worked in Hyderabad for a while. And on the right, you have Maulana Muhammad Ali in the black Sherwani. And next to him, the taller man, is his older brother, Maulana Shaukat Ali. Now, Maulana Muhammad Ali died in December 1930 in London. And it was Shaukat Ali and Majid Pickthall who went on to create this scheme, this project for a revival of the Caliphate. And they worked together in this endeavor. And their plan, essentially, which turned out to be successful in the first instance, was to broker a marriage between the Nizam's eldest son, Prince Azam Jah, and the Caliph's only daughter, Princess Durrashahvar. And the idea was that this would bring together Islam's caliphal family and the richest Muslim family, the richest Muslim dynasty in the world. And so this marriage took place in Nice, in France, in 1931. Here is a famous photo of Princess Durrashahvar taken by the also very famous photographer Cecil Beaton. And Princess Durrashahvar was an extraordinary figure, one of the most extraordinary people of 20th century Islamic history, I would say. So she became a very highly educated poet, painter. She spoke several languages. She learnt them while she was in exile in France, they were sort of her formative years. She was only 10 years old when she was exiled from Istanbul, and she married Azam Jah when she was only 17 years old. But the Caliph gave her a choice and said that the marriage is not going to happen unless the young couple take a fancy to each other. And so she actively chose this marriage. And this quote here is from her time in Hyderabad, in which she articulated her vision of modernization and her justification of Hyderabad's modernization. So she said, ancient romantic customs are constantly fostered and are still dominant. Modern progress merely improves but does not kill them. And today in Hyderabad, she's still remembered for her philanthropy and a lot of her charitable work and work in education, and particularly women's education. So here we have a scene from the wedding in Nice, and alongside the marriage of Princess Durishvar and Prince Azam Jah, you had the marriage of Prince Muazzam Jah, who was the Nizam's youngest son, to another Ottoman princess, Princess Nilufar. So this is quite a remarkable photo, and it was a momentous moment. It was a moment of great political significance and was recognized to be as such. Obviously, what was behind it was this plan to revive the Caliphate. And the Caliph actually made it a condition during the marriage negotiations that the firstborn son of Prince Azam Jah and Princess Durishvar will be the Nizam of Hyderabad. So through this union, he was securing the future of his line. And this quote here on the left was issued by the Nizam's government upon the marriage. These marriages will unite two Muslim dynasties by the intimate ties of family love, an event which cannot fail to have a very happy repercussion on the whole Muslim world. So this was two great houses coming together. You had essentially the Ottoman legacy and the Mughal legacy coming together. You can also see it as the joining of the East and West of the Islamic world. Now, another part of the plan was a congress in Jerusalem, which became known as the World Islamic Congress. And it happened just weeks after this wedding in Nice. And it was instigated by Maulana Shaukat Ali. And the plan that he hatched with the Caliph was that Caliph Abdul Majid would actually go to the Congress in Jerusalem, where notables and leaders from across the Islamic world would be assembled, and he would there rally support for a revived Ottoman Caliphate. But Turkish spies got wind of the plan, and they lobbied Britain to ban Abdul Majid from entering Palestine, which was under the British mandate. And so the plan effectively failed. But it did have the effect of the Congress had a long-lasting legacy, which was that it was the first moment, really, when the Palestinian struggle became recognized as a pan-Islamic and pan-Arab struggle. So this was a very important moment in history. And you can see Maulana Shaukat Ali in the top photo there in the middle. Here you have a photo of a very early version of the Palestinian flag, which is actually presented to Shaukat Ali. And the quote I've included here was from Sir Muhammad Iqbal, the very famous poet philosopher, who addressed the attendees of the conference and declared, "I'm not afraid of the enemies of Islam. My fear is from the Muslims themselves." So now, this is the legacy, I suppose, of this marriage. You have Prince Azam Jah, Princess Durishvar, and their young son, Prince Mukarram Jah, who was born in 1933 in France. Now, while he was very young, the Nizam secretly decided, so only his very close circle found out, that actually Azam Jah was not going to be the next Nizam. The next Nizam was going to be his son, Mukarram Jah. This was highly unconventional, but this was what was decided. And there are different theories as to why. One quite common theory is that Azam Jah was not considered sort of suitable to rule. He wasn't considered to have the, the requisite political talent or even the desire to do so. But Mukarram Jah, this baby, his grandfather on the maternal side was the last Caliph of Islam, and his grandfather on the paternal side was the richest man in the world, the Nizam of Hyderabad.
The boy does look rather fierce. I think he has all the characteristics to be a fearsome ruler, I think.
Exactly, yes. And here you have Prince Muazzam Jah and Princess Nilufar, both extraordinary and very colourful people. Now, their marriage wasn't a success at all, and they eventually divorced, and Princess Nilufar ended up living in France for the rest of her life. But Prince Muazzam Jah was often known as the best dressed man in Europe, and that was because whenever he travelled, he would have 30 suits brought with him, and you can sort of tell when you look at that photo of him there. But he was also a sort of poet prince in Hyderabad, and he would hold what was known as the nocturnal court. So his select courtiers would assemble every night after dinner, and the poetry and performances and music would carry on until the morning. And he's such a significant poet. His pen name was Shaji. that actually his poetry is still regularly performed to this day. And here I've included the English translation of some of his verses. You know, when thought of you came, it was lonesome indeed, to neither joy nor sorrow did it lead. The one who destroys the world of my heart, for that heartless one, this heart still yearns. So using all the themes of the Urdu ghazal. Now, here we get on to the political legacy of the whole thing. In 1944, Caliph Abdul Majid died in Paris, where he was living during World War II, of a heart attack because of a gunfight between American and Nazi German soldiers.
Oh.
After he was killed, his will was brought to Hyderabad. And it was a time of flux, and all convention had broken down, and the Ottoman family recognized the eldest prince as head of the family, but he didn't claim the Caliphate. But Abdul Majid's son, Prince Umar Farooq, claimed that he should be the head of the family, and so there was a contest over this. But then there's also the very important question of what did the Caliph want for his line and the future of his dynasty. Now, there's considerable evidence that the Caliph wanted the Caliphate to continue in Hyderabad and through Mukarram Jah. So this quote is by Sir Arthur Lothian, who was the British resident in Hyderabad at the time, who found out, although the Nizam had tried to keep it from him. So this quote, the Nizam also omitted to tell me the interesting fact that the ex-Sultan, he's making a mistake, he means the ex-Caliph, had named therein Mukarram Jah, son of the Prince and Princess of Berar, the titles of Azam Jah and Princess Durushabar, as his successor in the Caliphate. So the British found out about this, and British officials discussed it among themselves and said, what should we do? Particularly since in 1946, the Nizam asked to have a tomb built for the Caliph in India, in Hyderabad state, which had been requested by the Caliph in his will. So British officials debated this among themselves, and their main concern was that it could get out that Mukarram Jah had been nominated the next Caliph, and this could cause a massive political commotion. However, they calculated that actually the Nizam wants to keep it a secret. Mukarram Jah is just a child. He's not going to be the ruler for years. We're going to be gone probably in a few years. So you know what? It doesn't matter. And so they gave permission for the tomb to be built. Now, this idea of Mukarram Jah becoming the Caliph, what we don't know is whether the Nizam agreed to it or went along with it. And there's no conclusive evidence. There are very credible claims by contemporaries, by people at the time, including those who are very close to elite figures in Hyderabad, that the Nizam did want to make Hyderabad the seat of the Caliphate. And also Shahid Hussain Zuberi, who was he was a close confidant of Prince Mukarram Jah for many years, and he managed his estate. I spoke to him earlier this year and asked him about this, and he told me that Mukarram Jah himself had told him that, yes, the Caliph wanted me to be the successor to the Caliphate, and that the Nizam went along with this plan, and it was also the Nizam's ambition. But as I say, we don't have sort of the precise truth documented, is beyond our reach. But it's certainly plausible, given that the Nizam wanted Hyderabad to be an independent, or at least an autonomous state. So you can imagine if there was an Indian federation, and Hyderabad and the other princely states were allowed to be powerful and autonomous, which was a possibility as late as 1946, then it's possible to imagine that when Mukarram Jah was older and he was the Nizam, he might claim the caliphal title. And this wouldn't mean, I should say, a sort of a takeover of the Indian subcontinent by the Nizam. It would be the Nizam ruling in Hyderabad, claiming the caliphal title. And the only way that this would have any significance at all would be if he could gather support and recognition and sort of soft power from Muslim leaders and notables across the world. And it's quite possible that no one would have paid any attention. But also in an Indian federation, that would have been the largest populations of Muslims altogether in the world. So it's quite possible that it wouldn't.
At that time. Today, it's not, of course. It'd be in Indonesia, the largest.
Yes. But that's because of partition, because now you have it split into multiple countries. Whereas if it was if we look at the Indian subcontinent as it is, that would be you can easily imagine how that would be considered still the epicenter of the Islamic world. But equally, there could have been kind of religious civil war, or other sort of fighting. So we can never know. We can't sort of really guess at the counterfactual, because we're just shooting arrows in the dark. But this was the extraordinary consequence of this union between the Ottoman and the Asaf Jah dynasties. But of course, what you had was partition. And after partition, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, urged the Nizam to go for independence. And the Nizam did. He pushed to make Hyderabad an independent state, and chaos broke out. You had the Razakars, who were these sort of militia terrorizing Hindus in the state. By this point, the Nizam had basically lost control. You had absolute chaos. And then eventually the Indian government sent troops into Hyderabad. They annexed Hyderabad in late 1948. And in the aftermath, the consequence of the fall of Hyderabad was that you had sort of mass ethnic cleansing, mass exodus of people out of the state. And you also had the deaths of upwards of 25,000 people, mainly Muslims. And this is a very, very conservative estimate. And there's significant evidence that Indian soldiers were involved in these massacres. So you have these horrific atrocities in 1948 and in the aftermath. And they were covered up at the time, and there's still not really been any public reckoning in the Indian subcontinent with what happened here in Hyderabad. But those were the sort of tragic consequences of the invasion. And many historians have argued that, even though India would have most probably incorporated Hyderabad into the country, I mean, there was no way that they would have allowed this kind of massive state to just sort of continue existing in the middle of the country. The invasion was not necessary. And actually, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the prime minister at the time, he was not the one in favor of the invasion. It was the home minister who was really intent on making this happen.
Okay.
Here we have the elderly seventh Nizam, and a couplet that he composed, which I think really sums up his state of mind after the fall of Hyderabad. By the cruelty of fate, all pleasure is gone out of my life, Usman. Neither that wine remains, nor that company, nor the beloved. Now, this is metaphorical, the reference to wine, but this is the language of Urdu poetry.
And Sufism, you get in Sufi poetry like Rumi, where you get this language of wine. It's quite scandalous to some people, but hey, it's poetry, as you say.
Yes, and of course, often it was both literal and metaphorical. But in the Nizam's case, he wasn't actually a drinker. This is Prince Mukarram Jah. He became the titular 8th Nizam in 1967 after the 7th Nizam passed away. But he was essentially hounded out of India, and you had the total collapse of the princely orders under Indira Gandhi, who abolished the privy purses. And so Mukarram Jah ended up on an outback in Australia, which he enjoyed. And then he lived the final years of his life in obscurity in Turkey. And he finally passed away in 2023, so only a few years ago, in an apartment, a small apartment in Istanbul, and his neighbors didn't know who he was. And now he's laid to rest alongside his forebears in the central masjid in Hyderabad.
Amazing.
And so the final legacy of all this, you can still see that in this desolate, abandoned tomb here in the wilderness. And most people don't know what it is and why on earth there's a Turkish style tomb in the middle of India. But this is the story behind it. And the reason why I think this history is important is because it illuminates these forgotten connections between far-flung places. It's a reminder of how interconnected our global history has been. It's a reminder of India's often forgotten historical ties with the Middle East, of India's central importance in the Islamic world in the early 20th century, and also just in general of the union of the East and West of the global Islamic world during this period. So I think that's it from me.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Back to the cover there of the book. Very beautiful design, by the way. Whoever did a really beautiful job, I think.
Yes,
so
they did.
Yeah, this book is due to be published on the 11th of December. Is that right?
Yes, and the Indian edition is being published by HarperCollins India in January, I believe.
Now that will probably have a much bigger splash, I would imagine, in India than it might in the UK.
Well, yes, I think the Indian market is, hopefully very important for this book.
Yeah. Do you say at any point later in the book, on the conclusion, about the contemporary relevance of the Caliphate? Because this is not just a bit of, history. That this is a concept of political rulership, which is the ulama, the scholars say, all the scholars say, is part of the faith. We're supposed to have an imam, a ruler, a caliph, in a unified ummah with one, the family, the body of Islam in a way. Did you say anything about that political dimension?
Yeah, so generally, I think studies show that the idea of the caliphate still has a lot of contemporary resonance among Muslims, largely because it sort of signifies the ideal of kind of Muslim unity and Muslim strength, and people particularly like that when they're undergoing sort of what they see as political turmoil or hard times, and you often find more of this kind of this sort of sentiment after the fall of kind of great empires and great dynasties than before. So whenever the great power in the Islamic world has fallen in Islamic history, you then have a sort of revolution in Islamic political thought and a lot of dynamism injected into ideas of the caliphate. Now, many people, non-Muslims, particularly in the West, when you'd say caliphate today, and they think ISIS, this horrific militant terrorist organization that committed untold atrocities in the Middle East, of course, and also atrocities in the UK and other Western countries. However, you look at Caliph Abdul Majid, and this is a man who would be considered a heretic by ISIS. This is not the same sort of caliph, and the Ottomans generally were not. So this just indicates the diversity that there has been. I
sometimes want to interrupt you. The West lack of familiarity with these alternative conceptions of the caliphate, the apparent ignorance of people, and the focus on ISIS and ISIS-like, factions. I tend to suspect this is a deliberate attempt to delegitimize and to make horrible this concept, which actually has a beautiful and rich history, apart from that one example, and to sort of narrow it down to that, the archetypal evil, so as to rob Muslims of this very idea of Islamic rulership, which of course is very convenient and desired by the West, who want their own hegemony over the Muslim world.
Yeah. So that's one of the very interesting things about this history. And what I would also say is that I don't see Caliph Abdul Majid's attempt to revive the caliphate, or the political projects of Maulana Shaukat Ali and Majid Pickthall, as being simply restorationist attempts. I see them as being attempts by Muslim politicians to sort of forge and cultivate a new political future for Muslims in this post-imperial age, so after the Ottoman Empire. And the Caliphate has gone through significant transformations throughout history. So the Abbasid Caliphate in the medieval period looked very, very different to the Ottoman Caliphate. And the Ottoman Caliphate in its early days was conceived of in very mystical terms, and it was actually Sufis and philosophers that took center stage in defining what the Caliph was, what the nature of Caliphal authority was, whereas in the past it had been the jurists. Now, when you get to the 19th century, the Caliphate takes on a new significance because the Ottoman Empire lost a lot of its possessions, and it lost a lot of its possessions which had Christian majorities. So now the empire was more Muslim in its population than ever. It was struggling, and so there was a sort of need for a kind of rallying cry. Sultan Abdul Hamid felt, and a lot of other Muslims were under the control of European empires. So Sultan Abdul Hamid projected himself as a modern caliph and promoted pan-Islamic ideas, and also claimed authority over Muslims who were under other empires like the British Empire or the French Empire. But then also Abdul Hamid was an absolutist sultan. So he actually came to power off the back of a coup as a constitutionalist, and there was a parliament and there was a constitution. But then he had a sort of reversal and suspended parliament and locked all the princes up and governed as a sort of absolute ruler. And this was a particular modern vision of the caliphate. And that was countered by many people in the 1908 constitutional revolution. Now, this is often called the Young Turk Revolution, and it's considered to be entirely about westernization. And, you know, they deposed Abdul Hamid the following year in 1909. But actually, some very good recent research, including by the great historian Yaqub Ahmed, a British historian actually, has shown that the ulama, the jurists, were very involved in the 1908 revolution, and it was they that ensured that the revolution was actually bloodless, because they argued that the ideals of constitutionalism were Islamic. And so after 1908, you had a parliament again, and you had a constitution. And now the idea was that the caliph is accountable to the constitution. So this was a constitutional caliphate. And of course, the Young Turks then became increasingly dictatorial and authoritarian. And after the Ottoman Empire fell and the Sultanate ended, you had a new caliphate altogether, which was Abdul Majid's caliphate, where he was elected by the Grand National Assembly. So you have all these dramatic transformations in Islamic politics and Ottoman politics before the actual abolition of the caliphate, which is a sort of monumental moment. But what Abdul Majid continued arguing for was this post-imperial idea of the caliphate.
So, I mean, just changing the subject, if I may, just indulge me for a second. The caliphate, inshallah, will come back. I mean, I'm not saying that as a wishful hope, that there are hadith, authentic hadith, that speak of the return of the caliphate after a period of absence of caliphate. And this is all, it would seem, part of a prophesied plan in a way. Obviously, it's an impossible question to answer, but it's not just going to be a revived Ottoman caliphate, is it? I mean, this is an historical relic now. Too much water's passed under the bridge. We're now in a different world, aren't we? So it could theoretically come from anywhere, but could come from that region of what is now called Saudi Arabia, the Najd region. Who knows? But do you have any thought? Just speculate, here. What are your thoughts about where the caliphate, when it does return, God willing, will come from?
Well, I think that's far beyond my expertise and my capability. What I would say is that I'm definitely not arguing for a kind of revival of an Ottoman caliphate in India. This is early history, and actually the possibility of that ended really in 1948. Some people might say that it could have been a sort of symbolic caliphate afterwards, but I think realistically this sort of possibility ended in 1948, and we don't know if it had happened what it would have led to. Political Islam and Islamic political thought has continued to be very diverse since. And actually what's interesting is that a lot of modern Islamist and political Islamic movements have not actually emphasized the caliphate. They've emphasized, very other ideas. They've often been very nationally focused, often not. Often they've been transnational. But I think we can continue to expect in the sort of foreseeable future significant diversity and different varieties of political imaginations among Muslims. And I wouldn't seek to predict or foresee anything beyond that.
That's a very good answer. And of course, the question I posed to you was extremely unfair, but that was, but nevertheless, you briefly touched on this in your introduction, I think. Is it not the case, correct me if I'm wrong, that there is ijma, consensus amongst the ulama that the caliphate is, or Islamic rulership is actually integral and is required? It's not like a nice idea. It is intrinsic part of the Islamic way of life to have this ruler. Is that right, do you think?
I believe this is the case in Sunni Orthodoxy. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And even in Shia have a different understanding, but nevertheless they have a idea of rulership. So it's pretty much universal. But you're right.
It's important to remember that generally throughout Islamic history, Muslims they're often rival caliphates rather than a single caliphate. And throughout most of the Ottoman Empire's history, Muslims in India didn't care at all about the Ottoman Caliphate. Now, generally, the Mughals sort of nominally accepted the caliphal role of the Ottomans, but they also claimed themselves to be caliphs among the sort of many titles that they had. So it wasn't actually a challenge to the Ottomans' caliphal authority. It was just more that, we don't really care. We're our own huge, wealthy empire. And, the Ottomans can say what they like, but we care about our own ideas of kingship. And it was only after the fall of Mughal power that Indian Muslims started to look to the Ottomans, because now they were under British rule.
Yeah, very good, very good. Well, thank you very much. So I'm going to put links in the description below to your articles and on Middle East Eye, because you're the UK political correspondent, and also you're definitely worth following on X, not least because we can keep up to date about when your book is going to be published, when it actually is published, and discussions about that. Anything else that you tweet about as well. So thank you very much indeed, Imran Mullah, for your time, expertise. It's great to see your career really maturing and blossoming in the way it is doing. And I wish you every success, continued success in the future, inshallah.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. And I really appreciate you having me on. Real pleasure. Thank you.
Until next time. Salam alaikum.